Scientists now believe 3i Atlas may have sent the original WOW signal, and now, 48 years later, it's headed for Earth.
A low-frequency ripple, faint but unnervingly deliberate, pulsed across the deep space monitors long before anyone knew what it meant. At first, the signal resembled nothing more than distant background noise, the kind that usually dissolves into the static haze of interstellar radiation. But Atlas, the autonomous trans-Lagrange array system, caught a pattern no human operator would have noticed. Its algorithms flagged the transmission, isolated its structure, and began running comparative analyses. Within minutes, the system issued an alert: origin unknown, structure non-random, potentially artificial. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. For most teams across the network, this would have meant a long night of data cleaning. For 3i, the Interstellar Intelligence Initiative, it meant something entirely different. They had been waiting for a pattern like this for years, not in the sense of expecting it, but in the sense that they had built their entire program on the possibility that something like this could arrive one day. When Atlas forwarded the decoded packet to 3i's command node, the message forced an immediate shift from analysis to alarm. It wasn't what anyone hoped contact would look like, nor what any official policy had prepared for. There was no greeting, no mathematical baseline, no recognizable attempt at establishing shared meaning. What Atlas decoded carried the cadence of a warning, and its tone, despite coming from an unknown intelligence, felt unmistakably grim. The data block wasn't composed of symbols or characters. It unfolded as a cascading sequence of energetic modulations that Atlas translated as best it could into a human-readable framework, analogous to how a spectrogram becomes a visible image. Engineers found that the transmission contained layered structures, each one resembling a kind of conceptual scaffold. Atlas marked the layers as tiered directives, although the term directive came more from the severity of their configuration than any semantic interpretation. The first tier resembled a mapping grid, not spatial in any earthly sense, but instead referencing relationships between regions of energy distribution. The second tier condensed into a pulse pattern that the translation software interpreted as a timeline. And the third, the most haunting of all, formed an irregular oscillation that flashed with abrupt peaks, the closest thing a machine could approximate to an emotional signature. What unnerved the analysts most was that Atlas flagged the final tier with a single descriptor: imminence. No speculation was required to understand that the intelligence behind the message was trying to convey urgency. It wasn't subtle. The overall structure radiated tension, the kind found in natural systems when they are pushed toward collapse. Several researchers even described feeling a sense of pressure or unease while examining the data, as though the transmission itself carried an emotional weight. Of course, this wasn't literally true, but the metaphor reflected how profoundly the message disrupted analytical neutrality. Something about this signal felt like a desperate shout across the void, a shout produced by something that understood danger on a scale humans had never contemplated. As 3i's top team dug deeper into the first tier, they realized the mapping grid wasn't a representation of space, but of interaction. It charted the destabilization of energetic boundaries, the sort that appear only when a system is overloaded or strained past equilibrium. Nothing in the grid was familiar. No known celestial structures matched the configuration. But the contours resembled theoretical models of dimensional shear events, the type of phenomena that until now lived only in speculative physics papers. One scientist described it as a diagram of stress points in the fabric of reality. Another compared it to the way tsunamis propagate after deep-sea tectonic shifts. The transmission seemed to be pointing not to a place, but to a condition, as if to say, this is what is breaking. The second tier was even more haunting. Atlas's translation turned the pulse sequence into a kind of timeline, but not one measured in seconds, years, or astronomical cycles. Instead, it depicted a progression, a sequence of accelerating states. Analysts saw a pattern of rising peaks culminating in a sudden and permanent drop, almost like a heartbeat ceasing mid-pulse. If the translation was even partially correct, the sender was illustrating the final stages of a catastrophic process, one that moved from subtle distortion to irreversible collapse. Nobody could determine whether the timeline described something occurring now, something imminent, or something that had already happened to the sender's own civilization. But the tone of the message left little doubt that whatever was depicted was not hypothetical. It was happening somewhere, possibly everywhere. The third tier troubled the team the most. Its oscillations, erratic and sharp, carried a discontinuity that resembled cognitive distress. If an artificial intelligence could panic, or if an alien consciousness could imprint fear into a modulation pattern, this was what it might look like. The data spiked in uneven intervals, swelling and then collapsing as if the system generating the message were itself deteriorating. Atlas had to stabilize the pattern to even process it, which meant the original transmission likely fluctuated with unpredictable intensity. Some speculated that the sender was transmitting under duress, perhaps in a collapsing environment, perhaps while their reality was literally tearing apart around them. This idea spread the most anxiety, the possibility that the message was not a calm explanation delivered from a distance, but a frantic cry transmitted in the last moments of stability. From the moment the message became public, within 3i, conversations shifted from analysis toward interpretation. Nobody wanted to admit it openly, but the implications were too large to ignore. If another intelligence was warning of a structural collapse in some underlying cosmic framework, then humanity might be observing not just an extraterrestrial communication, but an early glimpse of a universal threat. The transmission's strange mapping grid, the one showing fractures or distortions, appeared uncomfortably similar to fringe theoretical models, suggesting that space-time might behave like a dynamic membrane. Under the wrong conditions, certain kinds of high-energy interactions could destabilize that membrane. Some models claimed that such instabilities could propagate across enormous distances, much like cracks spreading through tempered glass. If this was what the message described, then the collapse, shown in the second tier, might not be confined to the sender's region of space. It might, in theory, travel. Another unsettling interpretation emerged later that day. If the signal's patterns reflected not just description, but instruction, then perhaps the sender was not only explaining what was happening, but outlining the mechanisms that triggered the instability. This was the interpretation that raised the most alarms inside 3i's command center. The mapping tier, when inverted, behaved like a schematic, not a warning, but a blueprint. The idea that the message might contain a detailed representation of how reality could be fractured had terrifying implications. It meant the sender understood the process intimately, either from witnessing it or from causing it. Scientists argued over whether the signal constituted a distress call or a confession. Complicating matters further was the signal's intensity. It was far stronger than anything expected from its presumed distance. Signals decay over astronomical scales, but this one arrived with a level of coherence, suggesting it had been amplified deliberately, perhaps with technology beyond anything humans possessed. The refinement of the modulation patterns indicated a mastery over energy manipulation at a scale humanity had barely theorized. Whoever sent the message was advanced, not by decades, but by epochs. Yet despite this sophistication, the message was a shuddering, desperate thing. That contradiction, immense capability paired with palpable fear, unsettled everyone who examined the data. One researcher brought up an analogy that spread quickly through the facility. She likened the transmission to a shipwrecked survivor sending a final Morse code warning from a sinking vessel. The ship might have been enormous, the technology aboard magnificent, but the ocean is indifferent. When a hull breaches, even the grandest vessel becomes a coffin. If the sender inhabited an empire or civilization spanning light years, they might still have found themselves helpless in the face of whatever phenomenon the transmission described. Others pointed out the most chilling aspect. The sender had not included any coordinates. That omission raised a question that lingered heavily in the air. Why issue a warning without telling anyone where the danger was? Theories emerged, each more disturbing than the last. Perhaps the sender assumed the phenomenon did not obey conventional spatial boundaries. Perhaps the collapse wasn't localized. Maybe coordinates were irrelevant in the same way one does not specify a location during an earthquake that shakes an entire continent. Or perhaps the sender believed anyone capable of receiving the message was already in danger. As the analysts began integrating the tiers into a unified interpretation, they discovered a structural rhythm that threaded through all three. It wasn't immediately apparent, but when visualized in a single composite, the message formed a wave pattern that rose, peaked, and then dissolved into noise. This composite repeated several times before dissipating entirely. The repetition wasn't perfect. Each cycle deteriorated slightly, as though the sender were losing coherence with every iteration. Eventually, the cycles collapsed into a chaotic mesh of fluctuations that Atlas initially categorized as static. But when the noise was isolated, faint micropatterns emerged, tiny flickers of structure buried beneath the chaos. Those micropatterns transformed the interpretation again. They resembled decay signatures, the kind produced when a stabilized system transitions into entropy. Physicists recognized the patterns immediately. They looked strikingly similar to certain simulations of vacuum instability, the hypothetical process in which the underlying quantum field could shift into a lower energy state, effectively rewriting the laws of physics. If such a transition occurred naturally anywhere in the universe, the result would propagate outward at the speed of light, annihilating everything in its path without warning. This was considered a purely theoretical nightmare. Yet the similarity between the transmission's micropatterns and the predicted decay signatures reframed the entire message. The distress wasn't about a war or a cosmic accident or even a natural disaster. It seemed to describe a fundamental breakdown of the universe's stability, or at least a stability familiar to the sender. For the analysts, the question shifted from what happened to them to could this happen here? The horrifying part was that the message offered no reassurance. There was no suggestion that the threat could be avoided, mitigated, or even understood with any clarity. The transmission seemed less like an instruction manual and more like a dying star's final flare, a last burst of information intended for whoever might one day find it. It felt like a record left by beings who had already fallen into the dark. Yet there was also an undeniable intentionality. The structure was too precise to be incidental. The sender wanted the message to be found. They wanted its meaning to be pieced together, even if imperfectly. The warning, if it was one, had been crafted with urgency but not chaos. Its creators knew it might be the only thing that survived whatever catastrophe consumed them. One of the most striking debates within 3i centered on whether the sender had attempted to encode a final plea. Some analysts believed the third tier's emotional signature wasn't merely panic but a push toward action, a call to awaken others before it was too late. If so, then the sender's fate wasn't the core message. The core message was that the danger might not be confined to them. Others, however, saw a darker interpretation. The oscillations could be read not as a plea for help, but as a stark statement, no escape. In that reading, the message was less a warning and more a resignation, a final acknowledgement that some events cannot be outrun, that even advanced civilizations can be swallowed by forces more ancient and indifferent than themselves. The most distressing revelation came when analysts compared the structural harmonics of the message to the cosmic background radiation. They discovered a faint resonance, a subtle alignment between the transmission's frequency drift and a barely perceptible shift in the local vacuum baseline. The shift was tiny, far below any threshold that could affect matter or energy, but it existed, and it wasn't accounted for in previous deep space measurements. It had appeared recently, within the last few months. Atlas flagged the coincidence as improbable. This was the moment when a chill spread through the command center. The idea that the local quantum environment might already be showing early hints of instability, however minor, made the transmission feel less like a distant tragedy and more like a whisper from the future. Nobody knew what to do with this realization. It didn't imply immediate danger. There were no measurable impacts on matter, no distortions in gravitational or electromagnetic systems. But the correlation between the shift and the transmission's content suggested something that no one wanted to articulate aloud. The possibility that the phenomenon described in the message was not isolated, that whatever consumed the sender's environment might be part of a larger cosmic cycle. If this interpretation was correct, then humanity was not merely hearing about a distant disaster. It was receiving an advance echo of something that could one day, or perhaps 1 century or 1 millennium, reach its own region of space. The implications ran deeper than existential dread. They forced 3i to confront the possibility that the universe might be far less stable than previously assumed. Physics had always operated on the belief that the cosmic vacuum was stable, that the laws of nature were not prone to sudden, catastrophic shifts. The transmission cracked that belief open. Whether or not the phenomenon was truly universal, the fact that another intelligence had witnessed, and tried desperately to warn others about, a universe-level instability changed everything about how humanity perceived its place in the cosmos. The message's silence about solutions was perhaps the most tragic part. It offered no pathway, no formula, no insight into how the sender attempted to resist whatever overtook them. The transmission was stripped of anything resembling hope. It was raw observation wrapped in urgency. If the sender had once believed survival was possible, that belief had not survived long enough to be embedded in the message. What remained were only the facts of the collapse, described by those who lived through its earliest moments, but not its end. As the data continued to circulate through the facility, a sense of quiet dread settled in. People whispered, not out of superstition, but because the enormity of the message seemed to demand quiet. Researchers felt as though they were intruding upon the last moments of another civilization, witnessing their final attempt to communicate across unimaginable distances. The message became a kind of cosmic relic, a fragment of another world's dying voice. The implications for humanity were not immediately practical. There was no action to be taken, no emergency protocol to activate. The danger, if it was one, operated on scales impossible to influence. And yet, the transmission altered something fundamental in the minds of those who studied it. It forced them to recognize that the universe was not obligated to remain calm or benevolent. It did not owe stability to any species, no matter how advanced. The message shattered the comforting assumption that cosmic catastrophes occurred only in the distant past or in theoretical models. It replaced that assumption with a different understanding. The cosmos is more fragile than it appears. 3i's team continued extracting details late into the night, hunting for any hint of meaning that might have been overlooked. Some searched for patterns that could indicate a location. Others sought evidence that the message described a localized phenomenon rather than a universal one. A few dared to hope that the sender embedded a clue, some hidden instruction concealed within the decay patterns, a desperate final attempt to preserve their knowledge. But every reanalysis came to the same conclusion. The message was complete. Nothing was missing, nothing was hidden. It was simply a warning. Bleak, urgent, and painfully sincere. And though the transmission offered no explicit aftermath, no final note of what befell the intelligence that created it, the silence that followed spoke clearly enough. Atlas scanned for days, then weeks, and detected no continuation of the signal, no secondary transmission, no sign that the sender remained capable of speaking further. The message stood alone, a solitary beacon from the edge of catastrophe. Yet its implications endure. The transmission forces anyone who encounters it to confront the unsettling possibility that the universe can change and that such change can be catastrophic. It asks humanity to consider that even advanced civilizations may be powerless in the face of deeper cosmic processes. It leaves behind a lingering awareness, one that cannot be unlearned, that reality itself may have weak points, fractures, or thresholds beyond which everything familiar collapses into something unrecognizable. The message is horrifying not because it describes destruction, but because it reveals fragility. It reveals that life, intelligence, and civilization exist only because the universe remains stable, and that stability may not be permanent. Whatever sent the transmission understood this with absolute clarity, and in their final moments they reached across the void in the hope that someone else might understand it too. Their act was a warning, a message carried across the darkness, a reminder that even the most enduring structures can fall. And now that the warning has been received, it cannot be ignored. The deeper the researchers probed into the structure of the transmission, the more they realized its complexity extended far beyond the apparent three-tier system originally identified. While Atlas had summarized the tiers to create a workable framework, the raw stream was fractal in nature, branching in subtle ways that required new analytical tools to decipher. These hidden branches did not contradict the earlier interpretation. They expanded it, revealing an architecture of information woven into the signal like veins through living tissue. The signal was not a simple warning. It was a construct, something designed with layers of meaning, each only accessible once the previous layer had been understood. What unsettled the team most was that each new layer they uncovered seemed to anticipate their methods of decoding. It was as though the sender had predicted the progression of analysis, embedding interpretative doors that opened only when the right conceptual key was applied. This implied not only intelligence but familiarity with the logic of investigation itself. It hinted that the sender either shared cognitive principles with humanity or had studied species like humans long enough to predict how they would attempt to interpret a message of this nature. One unexpected discovery emerged when a physicist noticed nonlinear distortions hidden between the primary oscillation bands. At first, they appeared as gaps, the kind caused by signal degradation. But when Atlas enhanced the resolution, those gaps resolved into minute divergences that did not follow natural decay patterns. They were intentional breaks, placed with surgical precision. When the scientists mapped the gaps over time, they formed a secondary rhythm, a metronome beating beneath the surface of the message. This metronome did not align with any known natural cycle. It wasn't orbital, stellar, or quantum. Instead, its intervals matched the harmonic frequency of a theoretical structure known as a resonance boundary, a concept proposed in advanced cosmology but never observed directly. Resonance boundaries describe regions where the fundamental constants of a universe begin to fluctuate, often preceding large-scale transitions in the underlying physical framework. To most physicists, resonance boundaries were little more than elaborate mathematical conjectures. But seeing their signature hidden within an extraterrestrial transmission changed everything. The presence of these boundaries suggested that the sender understood the conditions under which the laws of nature become unstable. If they were embedding this harmonic structure into the message, it could mean that the collapse they described was triggered when these boundaries formed and intersected. The message, then, might not be merely descriptive. It could be a record of how the universe itself behaves when it approaches its limits. A new team within 3i formed to decode the resonance boundary cycles, but the moment they began analyzing them, an unexpected phenomenon occurred. The patterns in the message began to interact with their simulations, the data behaving as though it were dynamic. When they ran the harmonics through a quantum modeling engine, the simulation reacted in unpredictable ways, generating fluctuations that did not exist in the input parameters. It was as if the message carried instructions not just for interpretation, but for replication, prompting the environment around it to mimic the conditions it described. This discovery caused an immediate shutdown of the simulation lab. Nobody wanted to risk inadvertently reproducing the phenomenon described in the transmission, even at microscopic scales. The lab chief insisted that whatever the message was, it had to be treated as potentially hazardous information, not in the sense of a weapon, but in the sense that understanding it too deeply might create risks on its own. Knowledge can be dangerous when it interacts with reality in ways not fully understood. Yet despite the fear, curiosity drove the investigation forward. Another group of researchers examined the emotional oscillations embedded in the third tier, seeking to understand whether they represented a purely symbolic depiction of fear or something more literal. By modeling the oscillations in a multidimensional graph, they discovered that the pattern resembled the degradation curve of a cognitive system under prolonged stress. It behaved like the final neural output of a mind deteriorating under overwhelming pressure. This led to a chilling hypothesis. The message might contain traces of the sender's final conscious state. If true, the third tier was not just a warning, but a digital echo of a dying mind, or many minds, captured and encoded at the moment their reality was collapsing around them. The peaks and troughs represented their attempts to maintain coherence, to remain functional long enough to transmit this final message. In this interpretation, the message carried not only information about the collapse, but the emotional tone of those who lived through it, imprinted into the fabric of the signal. One neuroscientist noted that some of the oscillation patterns resembled the electrochemical signatures of human fear, despite being encoded in a form completely alien to biological neurons. This resemblance could not be coincidental. The emotions embedded in the message had a universal quality, a fundamental expression of distress that transcended biology and species. It implied that certain emotional states may be universal phenomena arising spontaneously in conscious beings facing existential annihilation. This raised another question that rattled the team. If emotional patterns can survive the collapse of an entire civilization and be transmitted across interstellar distances, what does that say about the nature of consciousness? The message suggested that consciousness might not be confined to neurological frameworks. It might propagate through energy patterns, imprinting its structure onto whatever medium is available when biological form begins to fail. Meanwhile, another branch of investigation uncovered something even more disconcerting. By comparing the amplitude drift of the signal with long-range astronomical data, the researchers discovered that the transmission did not originate from a singular point source. Instead, its frequency had been modulated by passing through multiple gravitational fields, each tugging on it in subtly different ways. This allowed the scientists to track the signal backwards, tracing its path across the region of space it had traveled through. What they found was startling. The transmission trajectory passed near several regions of unexplained cosmic voids, massive empty regions where galaxies and matter were expected to be but weren't. These voids have long puzzled cosmologists. They were too large and too sharp-edged to be accounted for by ordinary matter distribution. Some believed they were remnants of early cosmic inflation, while others suspected unknown astrophysical processes at work. The idea that the transmission came from near one of these voids suggested a disturbing possibility. Perhaps these voids were not natural at all. Perhaps they were the scars left behind by the collapse described in the message. If the sender's universe had shifted or decayed, the voids could be the aftermath, regions where the structure of space-time had already failed, leaving behind an emptiness deeper than conventional vacuum. The trajectory analysis grew even stranger when the team realized that the voids seemed to align with the harmonic structure of the resonance boundaries encoded in the message. That meant the voids were not random cosmic anomalies. They were part of a pattern that matched the collapse sequence, a pattern that might be expanding. The implications pressed heavily on everyone involved. It was no longer clear whether the message described something that had already happened, something that was happening now, or something that was about to begin. It could even be that the sender existed at the perimeter of a spreading collapse, desperately broadcasting outward in the hope that someone, anyone, might intercept the message before being consumed themselves. Another unsettling piece of evidence arose when a linguist analyzing the rhythm of the message discovered a recurring sequence woven beneath the larger tiers. It consisted of 3 pulses repeated at irregular intervals. Initially, this sequence seemed like noise or a simple checksum, but when isolated and examined, it formed a structure remarkably similar to prime number encoding, a common method proposed for interspecies communication. However, the pulse sequence did not represent prime numbers. It represented something more abstract, the mathematical profile of a destabilizing potential well. Essentially, it described the conditions under which a stable system begins to fall into a lower energy state, leading to sudden, irreversible transformation. In practical terms, it was a diagram of how collapse begins. This discovery ignited a new debate. If the message encoded the mathematical mechanism of collapse, was it meant as a warning or a description of inevitability? Was the sender teaching others how to detect collapse early or simply chronicling their final moments? The scientists could not agree. Every interpretation carried its own fears. In the midst of these debates, a small team studying the signal's polarization patterns made a discovery that caused widespread disturbance. The polarization shift of the signal indicated that the transmission did not originate from a stable spatial dimension. it had been influenced by something similar to dimensional drift, a phenomenon predicted in theoretical physics when reality folds or fragments. This drift suggested that the sender's environment might have already begun crossing into another state of existence, one where the distinction between dimensions was dissolving. The scientists had never observed anything like it. The drift was not strong enough to destabilize the Earth's environment, but it was measurable. And if drift can be measured in a signal, it implies that the medium through which the signal traveled has been affected as well. This raised the terrifying notion that the collapse described in the message could have multidimensional effects. It might not be confined to a single layer of reality. It might ripple outward across the deeper fabric of existence, subtly altering every dimension it touches. Despite all these revelations, one part of the transmission remained stubbornly resistant to interpretation: the ending. After the final oscillation pattern dissolves into noise, there is a faint, nearly invisible shift in frequency, a whisper at the edge of perceivability. It is so faint that it was initially categorized as background contamination. But once isolated, it revealed a curious structure, not chaotic but almost deliberate, like a final fragment encoded in a fading voice. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on 3i Atlas's new transmission and what happens next today? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.